Well, aside from being a writer, I also do work as a publishing consultant. I help and advise other writers in finding publishers for their books. And I came across this story when I was asked to try and help find a publisher for an English translation of Gustav Kleinmann's concentration camp diary. Now, we failed to find a publisher, although it is an enormously important historical document. Gustav's diary is extremely difficult to read. He wrote it very sketchily. He doesn't give a great many details, and he makes a lot of very obscure references to events and people, so that even a Holocaust historian wouldn't be able to understand a lot of it without consulting their reference books. But I could tell, reading the story and reading a short memoir that Fritz had written to go with it, I was absolutely convinced that this was a story that needed to be told to a wide audience. And so I figured that the best thing I could do was to bring my abilities as a researcher and a writer and make the book into a coherent, really readable, accessible account of their story, and also bring in their family story, because I felt that was just as interesting and also necessary to understand Gustav and Fritz's story. You had to know the family background that they came from and what happened to the other members of the family. So that's what I set about doing. I embarked on 2 years of research and a year of full-time writing. Yes, to some extent as a writer, or certainly for me as a writer, the skills and the techniques of pulling together a story as complicated as this tends to form a bit of a barrier between me and the emotion of the story. So it kind of protects me a little bit from some of the impact. It doesn't separate me from it completely, because you have to remain emotionally connected to the story and to the people. Otherwise, the story just wouldn't work. But you don't experience it with the same intensity as a person reading the book, because then you're getting all of it in one very short, intense rush. Whereas for me, it was spread over a very long time, and I was very focused on details of pulling together different threads, sorting out facts. But nevertheless, I was very emotionally involved in the story, and some parts of it impacted me very deeply, and some parts of it that I still find quite difficult to talk about now. The part of the story that affects me most deeply is not so much Fritz and Gustav's experience as Tini and Herta, Gustav's wife Tini and their daughter Herta, who were deported to the east in 1942 and murdered in a death camp near Minsk. That's an extremely difficult part of the story to cope with emotionally. It's so tragic. And especially because there are letters written by Tini to her little boy Kurt in 1941, in which are so full of love and so pinning her hopes for the future on her child, and so afraid of him for his future, that even now I find it quite difficult to even talk about that, thinking about it. And it was such a tragedy that because Tini had failed to get the last of her children to safety, Fritz and Herta, because it was so difficult to get people out. Well, it has a very strong emotional impact on readers. And yes, the British people have always had this almost an obsession with World War II, and it is very often triumphalist. And recently, some conservative politicians have been outraged at any suggestion that British actions in relation to the Holocaust were anything other than good and heroic. But Britain has a lot to be ashamed of, that the way it limited refugees, that the internment of Jewish refugees in 1940. And I think in that respect, I've very often had reactions from readers that the book reveals to them things that they didn't know about the Holocaust generally, about the details of the Holocaust, and specifically about the actions of Britain in relation to the Holocaust. Hardly any British people know that the British government interned, they rounded up Jewish refugees and put them in internment camps because they were afraid that they were enemy fifth columnists. There was a panic. Very few British people know things like that, and because it conflicts with this triumphalist vision of themselves and the Britain's role in the war.